My mother told me they could not afford another ticket, so my sister went on the family cruise instead. When they came home from their luxurious vacation, the house was completely empty, and every single item I had paid for was gone. They lost absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Lauren. I am 33 years old, and I work as a supply chain logistics consultant. I spend my days analyzing complex corporate systems, finding deep-rooted inefficiencies, and solving massive organizational problems. My brain is entirely wired for order, predictability, and fairness. Unfortunately, those are three concepts my family has never understood. Growing up in a sprawling Chicago suburb meant maintaining pristine appearances at all costs. Our massive colonial-style home with its perfectly manicured green lawn and grand wraparound porch was a fortress of carefully curated illusions. Inside those walls, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. I was always the responsible one. I was the quiet daughter who got straight A's, secured a highly demanding job, and never once asked for financial bailouts. For the past 12 months, I had been looking forward to our 2-week Caribbean family cruise. It was not just a simple vacation for me. It was supposed to be a major celebration. After years of grueling 60-hour work weeks, late-night international client calls, and completely sacrificing my personal life, I had finally secured a massive promotion to senior partner at my consulting firm. The cruise was my hard-earned reward. I had spent weeks researching the various ports of call, buying brand new resort wear, and meticulously organizing my work handovers so I could truly unplug. I needed this break desperately. I was exhausted down to the very marrow of my bones. The thought of sitting on a sun-drenched balcony with a cold drink, surrounded by the peaceful ocean, was the only thing that kept me going through the final, incredibly stressful quarter of the fiscal year. The morning of our departure, the Chicago air was thick with heavy midsummer humidity. I loaded my carefully packed suitcase into the trunk of my car, feeling a rare and beautiful sense of pure, unadulterated joy. I had planned to drive over to my parents' house early so we could all ride to the international airport together in the private luxury shuttle I had booked. I even bought a bottle of extremely expensive vintage champagne to share on the porch before we left. The drive took 45 minutes through heavy morning traffic, but I did not mind the delay at all. I listened to upbeat music, mentally checking off the essential items in my luggage, imagining the warm, white sand beaches of St. Thomas and the crystal-clear waters of the Bahamas. When I finally pulled into the wide paved driveway of my parents' suburban estate, everything looked deceptively normal. The lawn sprinklers were running on their automated timer, casting brilliant little rainbows in the bright morning sun. The large, ancient oak trees provided a deep shade across the front brick walkway. I parked my car, popped the trunk, and hauled out my heavy black suitcase. The wheels clicked rhythmically against the concrete as I walked up the long driveway, dragging my heavy carry-on bag over my left shoulder. I was smiling. I actually felt light for the first time in months. I reached the bottom of the wide wooden steps leading up to the wraparound porch, entirely ready to begin the celebration. That was when the heavy oak front door slowly opened. My mother, Barbara, stepped out onto the shaded porch. She was fully dressed for international travel, wearing a crisp white linen outfit, expensive designer sunglasses resting on top of her perfectly styled blonde hair, and a fresh salon manicure. But she did not look happy to see me. She did not smile. She did not offer a warm morning greeting or open her arms for a hug. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest and positioned her body directly in the center of the doorway, effectively blocking my path into the house. I paused at the top of the wooden steps, my eager smile faltering instantly. I let go of the retractable handle on my suitcase, utterly confused by her rigid and defensive posture. The champagne bottle felt suddenly heavy in my shoulder bag. I asked her if the private airport shuttle was running late. I asked if my father was still inside finishing his packing. I tried desperately to find any logical reason for the strange, hostile energy radiating from the woman who was supposed to be excited to celebrate my massive career milestone. Barbara let out a long, heavy sigh. It was the exact kind of dramatic put-upon breath she always used when she was about to deliver bad news and wanted to pretend she was the true victim of the situation. She looked down at my packed suitcase, then slowly dragged her gaze back up to my face. Her expression was completely devoid of any maternal empathy. She looked at me with cold indifference and told me I was not coming on the trip. The words hung in the humid morning air, thick and suffocating. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. I waited for her to laugh and say she was just playing a terrible practical joke. But her face remained entirely serious, set in stone. I asked her what she meant. I reminded her that my bags were packed, that my out-of-office email was already turned on, that I had been planning this elaborate trip with them for an entire calendar year. She casually adjusted her expensive sunglasses and informed me that due to budget constraints, my ticket had been canceled. I felt the warm blood drain entirely from my face. My mind, which was highly trained to process complex logistics and hard facts, completely short-circuited. Budget constraints. The phrase made absolutely no logical sense. I had paid for my own ticket months ago. I had sent the money directly to their joint checking account so my father could handle the group booking and ensure we all had adjacent premium cabins on the same deck. The money was already spent. The reservation was confirmed. I had seen the printed itinerary with my own eyes just 3 weeks ago. I stepped closer, my voice rising in profound disbelief. I demanded to know what budget constraints she was talking about. I reminded her that I transferred a very large sum of money for my specific portion of the trip. I asked where my money went and how a fully paid ticket could just be casually canceled without my explicit authorization. Barbara waved her manicured hand dismissively in the air, a condescending gesture that always made my blood boil. She told me the expenses for the trip had gotten completely out of hand. She claimed the international flights were more expensive than anticipated, the daily port fees had increased drastically, and they simply could not afford to cover the extra hidden costs for everyone. So she explained with a chilling lack of emotion, they had to make a difficult executive decision and cut back on the guest list. I stood there paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her statement. I asked her why she did not tell me this yesterday. Why she did not tell me a week ago. Why she let me spend weeks anticipating this vacation, packing my bags, and driving 45 minutes to their house this morning. Why did she wait until I was standing on her front porch with my luggage to tell me I was uninvited? She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by my very valid reaction. She said they did not want to deal with my dramatic outbursts over the phone. She claimed they meant to tell me last night, but things got too busy with packing and last-minute travel preparations. She actually had the absolute nerve to say she thought it would be better to explain it in person, face to face, as if ambushing me on the porch was an act of grace. The disrespect was staggering. It was not just the devastating loss of the vacation or the mystery of the missing money. It was the complete and utter disregard for my time, my feelings, and my basic human dignity. They had let me wake up excited, get dressed, and drive all the way here, knowing full well they were about to turn me away at the door. I gripped the wooden railing of the porch, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. I told her this was unacceptable. I told her she could not just cancel my hard-earned vacation on a whim without even consulting me first. I demanded to speak to my father immediately. I wanted clear answers. I wanted to see the financial receipts. Barbara took a step forward, her voice hardening into a sharp blade. She told me to lower my voice and stop embarrassing myself in front of the neighbors. Then she delivered the ultimate gaslighting tactic. She told me I worked too much anyway. She said I was always stressed, always tied to my corporate phone, and that I would have just brought my professional anxiety on the cruise and ruined the relaxed vibe for everyone else. She told me I needed to learn to be flexible, and that this unexpected staycation would actually be good for me. According to my mother, denying me the vacation I had paid for was somehow a favor to my mental health. She suggested I use the 2 weeks to catch up on sleep, deep clean my apartment, and focus on my new promotion. She completely invalidated my profound exhaustion, twisted my dedication to my career into a toxic personality flaw, and used it to justify stealing my much-needed rest. I felt a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of my stomach. The anger that had been simmering was rapidly cooling into something much sharper and much more dangerous. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a logistical error. This was a deliberate, calculated exclusion. And the casual cruelty of her delivery, the way she stood there in her expensive resort wear, telling me to be flexible while stealing. My joy shifted something permanent inside me. I looked at the massive house behind her. The house that looked so incredibly perfect from the outside. The house that hid so many ugly, undeniable truths. I was about to demand my money back when a car turned into the driveway, pulling up right behind mine. The real reason for my canceled ticket was about to step out of that vehicle, and the intense betrayal I was feeling was about to multiply tenfold. A sleek black rideshare vehicle pulled into the driveway, rolling to a quiet stop right behind my parked car. The rear passenger doors swung open simultaneously, and the sound of loud, bubbly laughter shattered the tense morning air. Out stepped my younger sister, Ashley. She is 30 years old, chronically unemployed by choice, and currently sporting her fourth engagement ring. Her latest fiancé, Chad, bounded out from the other side of the car. He adjusted the collar of his brightly colored polo shirt before leaning into the trunk and wrestling two massive luxury suitcases out onto the pavement. They were giggling together like teenagers, entirely oblivious to the heavy tension radiating from where my mother and I stood on the front porch. Ashley was already dressed for a tropical paradise, wearing a woven sun hat, oversized designer sunglasses that hid half her face, and a flowing floral resort dress that dragged slightly on the concrete. She clutched an iced coffee cup in one hand and her smartphone in the other, her thumbs flying across the screen as she documented her travel morning for her social media followers. She did not even seem to notice the intense confrontation she was walking into. Ashley strutted up the wide brick walkway, her expensive strappy sandals clicking loudly against the stone. She finally spotted me standing by my heavy black luggage. She did not look confused to see me standing there instead of loading my bags into a vehicle. She did not look guilty or apologetic in the slightest. She just flashed her perfectly bleached smile and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh of relief. "Lauren," she chirped, flipping a strand of blonde hair over her bare shoulder. "Thanks so much for coming over early to help us load the bags into the shuttle. Chad and I are running on empty fumes right now. Packing for a 2-week luxury vacation is just so incredibly exhausting, you know how it is." Chad jogged up behind her, completely clueless to the dark reality of the situation, and clapped my shoulder with a heavy, overly familiar hand. He bragged about how ready he was to hit the deck for bottomless poolside margaritas, and how much he desperately needed a break from his part-time hours, managing inventory at his uncle's car dealership. I stood completely frozen in place, gripping the retractable handle of my suitcase so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white. I could not force a single word past the tight lump forming in my throat. Ashley breezed right past me, bounding up the wooden stairs and enveloping our mother in a massive theatrical hug. Barbara patted her back affectionately, her entire demeanor transforming from cold hostility to warm maternal pride. Then Ashley dropped the phrase that made the blood in my veins run completely ice cold. "Mom, you were totally right," Ashley squealed, bouncing on her toes. "The owner's suite is going to be absolutely perfect for our romantic pre-wedding moon. I cannot believe you guys managed to secure that room for us. The owner's suite." My highly analytical brain processed the words and calculated the grim logistics instantly. I had originally booked a premium balcony cabin for myself using my own credit card. The cruise line had been sold out of suites for nearly 6 months. The only possible way to secure a room, let alone the most expensive luxury suite on the entire ship, was if someone else canceled their trip entirely, or if an existing reservation was transferred and upgraded through the concierge desk. I looked sharply at my mother, who was suddenly very interested in adjusting Chad's shirt collar, avoiding my furious gaze entirely. The puzzle pieces snapped together with violent clarity. There were absolutely no budget constraints. They did not cancel my ticket to save money on daily port fees or international flights. They had deliberately transferred my fully paid reservation directly to Ashley. But transferring the ticket was only half the equation. An upgrade to the owner's suite cost many thousands of dollars money my parents supposedly did not have in their budget. Just last month, my father had called me on a Tuesday evening sounding frantic, stressed, and completely desperate. He claimed the house's aging central heating and cooling system had catastrophically failed and needed immediate repairs before the brutal summer heatwave hit the Chicago suburbs. I had transferred $15,000 directly from my savings to their joint checking account to cover the emergency replacement. I did it without questioning him, wanting to make sure they were comfortable and safe in their home. The house repair fund was never for the house. It was the upgrade money. They had used my emergency funds to elevate my sister's stolen vacation to the highest tier of luxury. The heavy front door opened wider, and my father, David, stepped out onto the shaded porch, carrying a canvas travel bag and his polished golf clubs. He stopped dead in his tracks the second he saw me standing next to my suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. The healthy color drained completely from his face. He looked at the concrete porch, then at the bright morning sky, then down at his expensive leather loafers. He would not make eye contact with me. He shifted his weight uncomfortably from side to side, gripping the strap of his travel bag like a defensive shield. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, ignoring my mother and my sister, who were still chatting happily nearby. I demanded he look at me right now. My voice was dangerously quiet, lacking any of the dramatic hysteria they always accused me of possessing whenever I raised a valid concern. I asked him directly if my $15,000 emergency repair fund paid for Ashley's luxury suite on the ship. I asked him how he could look me in the eye a month ago and lie about a broken air conditioner while secretly planning to hand my hard-earned money to his favorite daughter to fund her romantic getaway. His face flushed a deep guilty and very dark shade of crimson. He mumbled something incredibly vague about reallocating family resources to where they were most needed at the current moment. He said Ashley had been feeling very stressed about her upcoming wedding planning and desperately needed the extra space to decompress properly. He actually tried to justify stealing $15,000 by claiming my sister's wedding anxiety took precedence over my financial security, my generosity, and my basic trust in my own parents. I opened my mouth to respond, ready to tear apart his pathetic excuse, but Barbara clapped her hands sharply together. The sudden sound echoed like a gunshot across the quiet suburban lawn. She stepped aggressively between my father and me, her face pulled into a tight scowl. She told me I was causing an unnecessary scene and ruining their joyful send-off with my bitter negativity. She said Ashley deserved this romantic getaway before taking on the immense stress of tying the knot, and that as her older sister I should be proud to contribute to her happiness instead of acting so incredibly selfish. Selfish. She looked me directly in the eye and called me selfish, while standing in front of a house I secretly paid for holding luggage, packed for a trip I funded, preparing to leave me behind on the curb. She told me to go back to my empty apartment, focus on my new corporate promotion, and stop acting like a spoiled child. Just then, the private airport shuttle, a sleek black van I had personally booked and paid for months in advance, rolled smoothly into the driveway, pulling up behind my parked car. The driver stepped out immediately, opening the rear doors to assist. My family did not hesitate for even a single second. David practically ran to the van, tossing his golf clubs into the back to escape my stare. Chad loaded the massive designer suitcases, while Ashley climbed excitedly into the plush leather seats. Barbara gave me one final warning glare, a silent command to stay quiet, before stepping into the van and sliding the heavy door shut behind her. Ashley rolled down the tinted window as the engine revved. She waved her hand cheerfully, shouting over the noise that she would be sure to bring me back a nice magnet from the Bahamas. The shuttle shifted into gear, reversed slowly out of the driveway, and merged seamlessly into the steady flow of morning traffic. I watched the red taillights slowly disappear around the corner. I stood there rooted firmly to the warm concrete, my fingers gripping the retractable handle of my black suitcase. The silence of the massive property wrapped around me thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. The cold, brutal reality of their ultimate discard settled over my shoulders heavy and absolute. I was completely alone in the driveway, abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me most. The morning sun beat down on the concrete driveway, casting a harsh glare over the quiet suburban street. I stood there for a long time, simply listening to the distant hum of traffic and the cheerful chirping of birds in the old oak trees. My hands were still gripping the handle of my luggage so tightly that my fingers had gone completely numb. Slowly I let go and watched the black suitcase wobble slightly before settling onto the pavement. A gentle breeze rolled through the manicured lawns of the neighborhood, rustling the leaves and making the automated sprinklers spit water in a rhythmic pattern. It was a beautiful day for a vacation. It was a terrible day to realize your entire family viewed you as nothing more than a disposable ATM. I turned my back to the empty street and looked up at the massive colonial house looming over me. To the neighbors and the country club friends, my parents were affluent suburbanites, living out their golden years in a gorgeous two-story home with white pillars and immaculate landscaping. They threw lavish holiday parties and hosted elegant summer barbecues on the sprawling back patio. They projected an image of absolute financial security and generational wealth. I walked slowly up the brick pathway, dragging my suitcase behind me. The wheels clattered against the stone, echoing in the hollow silence they had left behind. I reached the front porch and pulled my heavy key ring from my shoulder bag. My hands were shaking slightly as I sorted through the metallic keys, finding the brass house key. I slid it into the heavy deadbolt and turned it. The heavy oak door swung inward with a soft click, revealing the grand foyer. I stepped over the threshold and pulled my luggage inside, shutting the solid wood door firmly behind me. The sudden quiet of the interior was absolute. The house smelled faintly of my mother's expensive floral perfume and the rich dark roast coffee they had brewed before leaving. I left my suitcase resting by the front door and walked slowly into the formal living room. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. I looked around the room, taking in every single detail. I looked at the enormous $8,000 custom leather sectional sofa dominating the center of the room. I looked at the hand-woven Persian rug resting beneath a solid walnut coffee table. I looked at the massive flat-screen smart television mounted above the stone fireplace and the high-end surround sound speakers discreetly installed in the ceiling corners. My mother loved to tell her friends that she had hired an exclusive interior decorator to curate the space. She loved to brag about her exquisite taste in luxury furnishings. She never once mentioned that I was the one who actually paid for every single piece of furniture in the room. I walked through the living room, tracing my fingers along the smooth, polished back of the leather sofa. 4 years ago, this perfectly curated suburban dream had almost completely shattered. My father had made a series of incredibly arrogant and disastrous financial decisions, attempting to launch a boutique consulting firm that failed spectacularly within 18 months. He had quietly drained their retirement accounts and secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on the house to cover his mounting business debts. They hid the truth from everyone, including me and Ashley, until the bank officially began foreclosure proceedings. I still vividly remember the tearful, panicked phone call from my mother begging me to save them from the ultimate social humiliation of losing their home. She was terrified of what her country club friends would say. She was horrified at the prospect of moving into a small apartment. I was 29 years old at the time, working 80-hour weeks to build my career, and I had just accumulated a very healthy savings account. I did not want to see my parents on the street. I did not want them to suffer that kind of profound public embarrassment. Because my brain works entirely in logistics and risk management, I did not just hand them cash. I formed a private limited liability company under my own name. I used my savings to purchase the house entirely in cash, directly from the bank, effectively stopping the foreclosure process in its tracks. I allowed my parents to remain in the house rent-free under a formal tenancy agreement. I wanted to protect their fragile pride, so I agreed to keep the entire arrangement a strict family secret. To the outside world, they still owned the beautiful colonial estate. To my sister Ashley, they were still the wealthy, successful parents who could bankroll her endless whims. I paid the property taxes. I paid the premium homeowners insurance. I even paid to furnish the entire house with brand new luxury items because my mother claimed the old furniture carried too many bad memories of their financial struggle. I gave them everything they needed to live comfortably and securely. I asked for absolutely nothing in return except their basic respect. I walked out of the living room and moved down the wide hallway toward the back of the house where my father kept his home office. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my shoes. The walls of the hallway were lined with framed family photographs. I paused to look at a large professional portrait taken 2 years ago at a charity gala my parents attended. Ashley was standing right in the center, wearing a stunning sequined gown flanked by my beaming mother and proud father. I was not in the picture. I had been working late that night to cover the quarterly property tax bill for this very house. They had not even bothered to save me a seat at their table. I turned away from the photographs and pushed open the heavy wooden door to my father's study. The room smelled of old paper and the expensive cigars he smoked on the back patio. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes he never actually read. Behind his massive mahogany desk sat a heavy steel floor safe securely bolted to the wall. I needed my passport. I had originally brought it to the house 3 weeks ago when my father demanded to double-check all the expiration dates for the cruise line manifest. He had insisted on locking it in his heavy steel safe for safekeeping until the morning of our departure. He claimed he did not want me to accidentally leave it at my apartment in a rush. I walked around the heavy mahogany desk and knelt down on the plush carpet in front of the safe. The digital keypad beeped softly as I pressed the electronic buttons. I knew the code because I was the one who had purchased and installed the safe for him 3 years ago. I entered the 6-digit combination and the heavy locking mechanism engaged with a solid metallic clunk. I pulled the heavy steel door open. The inside of the safe was neatly organized with various manila folders stacked in a metal rack. I reached into the top shelf and pulled out the small stack of dark blue travel passports. There were only 2 passports sitting there. Mine and my father's expired backup passport. He had already taken his active passport, along with my mother's and my sister's travel documents. I held my passport in my hand, staring at the gold eagle stamped on the dark blue cover. A profound wave of exhaustion washed over me. I was supposed to be sitting in a luxury airport lounge right now, waiting to board a flight to a tropical paradise. Instead, I was kneeling on the floor of a house I secretly owned, going through a safe looking for travel documents I no longer needed. I let out a long, slow breath and tossed my passport onto the surface of the mahogany desk. I prepared to close the heavy steel door of the safe, but something caught my eye on the bottom shelf. Sitting entirely alone on the bare metal surface was a crisp white envelope that had been hastily torn open. The flap was jagged and folded back, revealing a thick stack of printed paper inside. The bright blue logo of a major national bank was clearly visible on the top corner of the exposed document. I frowned, feeling a sudden prickle of apprehension at the back of my neck. My father was normally incredibly meticulous about filing his financial documents in clearly labeled folders. Leaving a torn envelope carelessly tossed on the bottom shelf of the safe was entirely out of character for him. I reached into the dark space and pulled the envelope out into the light. I slid the thick stack of paper out of the torn opening. It was a printed monthly statement for a premium platinum credit card. I looked at the name printed clearly at the top of the statement, and my heart skipped a painful, irregular beat. The account was entirely in my name. I recognized the specific account number immediately. 3 years ago, shortly after my parents had settled into their rent-free arrangement, my mother had suffered a minor health scare involving her blood pressure. She had panicked about the cost of potential emergency room visits and out-of-pocket medical expenses. Wanting to ensure they never had to worry about healthcare costs, I had opened a joint credit card account with a massive available balance. I put the account under my name using my excellent credit history to secure a premium interest rate and issued physical cards to both my mother and my father. I had looked my parents directly in the eye and handed them those plastic cards with one very strict, explicit rule. The account was to be used for genuine medical emergencies only, nothing else. I trusted them to respect that single boundary. I trusted them to honor the enormous financial lifeline I had extended to them. I stood up slowly from the floor, holding the thick paper statement in my trembling hands. The top of the page listed the current billing cycle and the payment due date. Below that, printed in bold black ink, was the total current balance. I stared at the number, blinking my eyes rapidly, trying to make sure I was reading the digits correctly. The numbers did not change. They remained stark and absolute against the white paper. The total outstanding balance on the medical emergency credit card was $45,000. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. $45,000. It was an astronomical, impossible figure. Neither of my parents had experienced a medical emergency in the past 3 years. There had been no hospital stays, no surgeries, no expensive prescription medications. I had spoken to them almost every single week, and their health had been perfectly fine. My eyes darted down the page, moving from the total balance to the itemized list of individual charges. The logistics expert inside my brain immediately began categorizing and analyzing the data points. I flipped to the second page, and then the third page, scanning the long columns of dates, merchants, and dollar amounts. The physical shock radiating through my body began to harden into something entirely different. It was no longer just the sting of being left behind on a family vacation. It was the realization that the betrayal ran far deeper and darker than I could have ever possibly imagined. The itemized charges told a complete and undeniable story of staggering unchecked theft. The itemized charges told a complete and undeniable story of staggering unchecked theft. I let my eyes scan down the very first column of the printed statement. The first major charge that jumped out at me was from a high-end bridal boutique located downtown. It was dated 3 months ago for the astronomical amount of $8,500. I knew exactly what that transaction represented. Ashley had bragged endlessly at family dinners about finding the perfect custom designer wedding dress. She had told me with a smug smile that our parents were generously dipping into their hard-earned retirement savings to make her bridal dream come true, because she deserved to feel like a princess on her big day. They had not dipped into their retirement savings at all. They had swiped the emergency medical credit card I provided to pay for layers of imported silk and hand-sewn French lace. My breathing grew shallow and uneven as my eyes darted to the next set of charges grouped together on the page. There was a cluster of massive transactions originating from Las Vegas, dated just 2 weeks ago. I saw several $1,000s charged at a luxury casino resort, exorbitant bar tabs at a famous nightclub, and a massive authorization for a VIP pool cabana. This was Chad's bachelor party. My father had casually mentioned to me over the phone that Chad and his groomsmen were taking a budget-friendly road trip for the weekend. The grim reality was that my personal credit line was currently funding premium bottle service and luxury cabanas for a grown man who could barely hold down a part-time job managing inventory. I flipped the heavy paper to the second page, my hands trembling with a toxic mixture of raw adrenaline and profound physical disgust. There it was, the luxury cruise line charges. The original booking for the standard balcony cabins was listed, but right below it were the massive upgrade fees. They had charged the thousands of dollars required to secure the prestigious owner's suite directly to my emergency account. They had even prepaid for the premium top-tier beverage packages and luxury spa treatments for the duration of the entire tropical trip. The $15,000 cash transfer I had sent them specifically for the fake air conditioner repair was completely separate from this credit card bill. They had taken my cash under false pretenses, and then they had maxed out the credit card on top of it to ensure they lacked nothing. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was absolutely breathtaking. They had orchestrated this entire elaborate financial scheme under the firm assumption that I was simply too busy working my corporate job to ever notice the missing funds. And they were almost right. I had set the credit card to auto-pay the minimum balance from a secondary checking account to ensure they would never face a declined card in a true medical crisis. I had explicitly requested that paper statements be mailed directly to their house because I wanted to keep the digital clutter in my personal email inbox to an absolute minimum. I trusted them to file the statements securely in the home office. They knew my corporate schedule was punishing, and they weaponized my career success against me. They relied entirely on my exhaustion and my blind familial trust to fund an extravagant lifestyle they had absolutely no right to claim as their own. I dropped the bank statement onto the polished mahogany desk. The paper felt heavy, coated in years of deceit. A cold metallic sensation began to spread deeply through my chest, replacing the initial shock with a highly focused, vibrating anger. I needed to move. I needed to physically walk through this massive house that I owned and see exactly what else they had been hiding in plain sight while smiling to my face. I stepped out of my father's study and walked down the wide hallway toward the main staircase. The house was entirely silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning system, the very system that was supposedly broken beyond repair just last month. I climbed the carpeted stairs, my hand sliding along the polished oak railing. I reached the second-floor landing and turned deliberately toward the guest wing. Ashley had moved out of the house 3 years ago when she first moved into a rental with Chad, but my mother had insisted on keeping her childhood bedroom entirely intact, as a dedicated shrine to her golden child. Barbara had told me repeatedly that they simply did not have the time or the emotional readiness to convert the space into a proper guest room for visitors. I walked down the long hall and stood in front of Ashley's closed white bedroom door. I reached out, turned the cool brass knob, and pushed the door open. The room was a chaotic disaster zone. It looked as though a tornado had ripped through a luxury department store. Discarded clothing was draped over the back of the plush vanity chair. Empty shopping bags from high-end retailers were piled haphazardly in the corner. But what caught my immediate attention was the white wooden vanity table pushed against the far wall. The surface was covered in a sprawling, messy array of cosmetics, jewelry, and accessories. I walked slowly into the room, my eyes scanning the clutter with clinical precision. Resting right in the center of the vanity was a familiar frosted glass jar with a heavy silver lid. It was my premium night cream, a customized skincare formula imported from Switzerland that cost $400 a jar. I had noticed it missing from my apartment bathroom 2 months ago after my mother and sister had stopped by for a quick lunch date. I had assumed I misplaced it or absent-mindedly left it at a hotel during a recent business trip. But here it was half empty, sitting carelessly among Ashley's cheap makeup brushes. My gaze drifted down to the floor near the open closet door. Slouched against the white baseboard was my limited edition leather tote bag. It was a highly specific milestone gift I had purchased for myself after successfully closing my first major corporate contract 5 years ago. It had vanished from my apartment closet last winter. My mother had actually helped me search my entire apartment for it, offering sympathetic words while suggesting I was simply too disorganized and stressed to keep track of my own belongings. She had stood right next to me, watching me tear my apartment apart in a panic, knowing full well the bag was sitting on the floor of this exact bedroom. I stepped closer to the vanity, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There was a large, ornate wooden jewelry box resting near the edge of the mirror. One of the small, felt-lined drawers was pulled halfway open. I reached out and gently pulled the drawer out further into the light. Tucked beneath a tangled mess of cheap costume necklaces and plastic bangles was a small faded velvet box. I recognized the deep burgundy color immediately. I picked up the velvet box, my fingers brushing against the worn, familiar fabric. I slowly opened the stiff hinge. Resting inside on the yellowed satin cushion were my grandmother's sapphire and diamond heirloom earrings. When my grandmother passed away, she had specifically designated these earrings for me in her will, citing my steady nature and my deep appreciation for our family history. My mother had been absolutely furious, believing the valuable jewels should have gone to Ashley to wear on her eventual wedding day. A year ago, the earrings vanished from my apartment safe. I had been utterly devastated, blaming myself for weeks, convinced I had somehow failed to secure the locking mechanism properly. Seeing them here tossed carelessly into a drawer, like meaningless plastic trinkets, shattered the final fragile illusion I held about my family. This was not just a case of financial opportunism or poor boundary management. This was not just them taking advantage of a wealthy, busy daughter who could afford to absorb a few losses. They were actively maliciously stealing from my home. They were invading my personal sanctuary, taking the things I worked incredibly hard for, taking the things that held deep, irreplaceable sentimental value, and hoarding them here in this suburban fortress I bought to keep a roof over their heads. They viewed everything I owned, my money, my property, my family heirlooms, as theirs for the taking. They believed they were inherently entitled to consume my entire life. I carefully closed the velvet box and held it tightly in the palm of my hand. I looked around the messy, entitled disaster of a bedroom, and the last remaining shred of daughterly affection withered and died completely. They had completely drained the deep well of my goodwill. There was nothing left inside me but the cold, calculating logic of a woman who had just realized she was funding her own emotional and financial destruction. I did not break down. My logistics expertise took over entirely, overriding any urge to cry or scream. I walked out of Ashley's bedroom, my steps measured and deeply purposeful. I did not shed a single tear. There would be time to process the emotional trauma later, perhaps years from now, with a highly paid professional therapist. Right now, I was a supply chain logistics consultant, and I had a massive critical operation to execute. My professional expertise was entirely built on identifying broken systems, stopping massive leaks, and implementing ruthless efficiency. The broken system was my family, the leak was my bank account, and the efficiency was about to be biblical. I walked straight down the stairs and settled myself at the large kitchen island. I pulled my smartphone from my shoulder bag and placed it flat on the cool granite countertop. I took a deep, steadying breath, organizing the necessary tasks into a mental flowchart. My first call was to my personal attorney, a sharp, aggressive corporate lawyer I kept on retainer. The phone rang twice before he answered. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I laid out the situation with clinical precision. I informed him that the occupants of the property I owned under my LLC had committed extensive financial fraud and stolen personal property. I told him I needed to immediately initiate the legal termination of their tenancy at will. My attorney was quiet for a moment, processing the swift escalation. He asked me to confirm that there was no formal lease agreement in place protecting their residency. I confirmed that they were simply guests living in my property on a month-to-month at-will basis with absolutely no legal claim to the home. He advised me on the strict legal protocols for our state. We needed to serve a formal 30-day eviction notice. I authorized him to draft the paperwork immediately, demanding that it be airtight and completely legally binding. As soon as I disconnected with my attorney, I dialed my accountant. This call was going to be significantly more complicated. When he answered, I instructed him to pull up the records for the joint medical emergency credit card. I listened to his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. I told him to look at the current balance of $45,000. I explicitly stated that I had not authorized a single one of the recent charges. I told him I needed to freeze the account immediately, cancel all active physical cards, and flag every transaction from the bridal boutique, the Las Vegas resorts, and the luxury cruise line as fraudulent. My accountant warned me that because they were authorized users on the account, the bank might fight the fraud claim. I told him I did not care how hard the bank fought. I wanted the dispute filed officially on the record, initiating a formal fraud investigation. I wanted the paper trail established to prove that they had grossly violated the explicit terms of the account. He promised to handle the bank representatives and lock down the credit line within the hour. I ended the call and sat in the quiet kitchen. The first phase of the operation was in motion. The financial bleeding was officially stopped. They could no longer spend a single dime of my money. The legal eviction was being drafted. They would soon have no legal right to reside in the house I bought for them. I placed my hands flat on the granite countertop, feeling the cool stone beneath my palms. I looked around the massive kitchen. The custom stove, the built-in luxury refrigerator, the expensive espresso machine sitting on the counter. I had paid for every single item in this room. I had furnished this entire house to ensure they lived in absolute comfort. Suddenly, the screen of my smartphone illuminated, vibrating softly against the granite. A notification popped up from the family group chat. I stared at the screen. It was a photo message from Ashley. I picked up the phone and opened the message. The image loaded in high resolution. It was a picture of Ashley and Chad standing on a massive sun-drenched private balcony overlooking the sparkling blue ocean. Ashley was wearing a brand new designer swimsuit, a sheer cover-up blowing perfectly in the ocean breeze. She was holding a tall crystal champagne flute leaning against the glass railing with a wide, triumphant smile. Chad stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, holding his own matching glass of champagne. The luxury of the owner's suite was evident in the background, showing private deck chairs and a secluded hot tub. Below the photograph, Ashley had typed a bright, enthusiastic caption, complete with multiple emojis. The text read, "Living our best life. Thanks to the best parents ever for this amazing pre-wedding moon. So blessed." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. She was thanking the best parents ever for a trip they stole from me. She was drinking champagne funded by my hard work. She was standing on a balcony paid for with my emergency funds. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of humor, born entirely from absolute chilling clarity. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the boring, workaholic sister and secured their perfect luxury vacation without any consequences. They were sailing away on the ocean completely disconnected from reality, raising a glass to their own cleverness. I set the phone back down on the counter, leaving the picture of their stolen joy glowing brightly. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not send an angry text message demanding answers. I did not call them to scream and cry. Silence was going to be my most devastating weapon. I reached into my bag and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I opened it on the kitchen island and powered it on. The screen flickered to life. I opened a fresh browser window. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began to type. I navigated directly to the website of the most highly rated premium moving company in the greater city area. I bypassed the standard quote forms and went straight to the priority booking section. I needed a massive fleet. I needed professional packers, multiple large moving trucks, and a secure climate-controlled storage facility. I had 14 days before the cruise ship returned to port. I had 14 days to execute the greatest logistical maneuver of my entire career. I began filling out the reservation details, my keystrokes sharp and precise in the silent house. I was about to show them exactly what my logistics expertise was truly capable of. The confirmation email arrived in my inbox with a soft chime. I stared at the bold green letters indicating a successful booking. Within 48 hours, a premium fleet of moving trucks would descend upon this quiet suburban street. I closed my laptop and left it on the kitchen island, the glowing screen the only source of light in the darkening room. Over the next 10 days, while my family sipped colorful cocktails at sea and charged premium excursions to my frozen credit card, I executed a military-grade logistical operation. I did not return to my own apartment. I stayed right there in the massive colonial house, sleeping in the master guest room, turning the formal dining room into my strategic command center. I spent the entirety of the next 2 days compiling an ironclad fortress of paperwork. I printed out the official deed to the house, highlighting the name of my limited liability company as the sole legal owner. I dug through my digital archives and printed every single receipt, invoice, and delivery confirmation for every piece of furniture, art, and appliance inside the property. I organized them into thick, color-coded binders. I needed to ensure that when the moving company arrived, there would be absolutely no question regarding my legal right to liquidate the entire estate. I was not stealing. I was simply reclaiming my own assets. On the morning of the third day, the lead coordinator from the moving company arrived for the preliminary walkthrough. His name was Greg, a sturdy man with a clipboard who looked thoroughly unimpressed by the suburban grandeur of the neighborhood. I greeted him at the door with my binders and a perfectly scaled floor plan of the property. I handed him the documentation proving my ownership of the LLC and the house. Greg reviewed the paperwork carefully, his eyes scanning the official county seals and my matching identification. Once he was satisfied that this was a legally sanctioned operation and not a domestic dispute he might get dragged into, I walked him through the house. I pointed to the massive leather sectional, the custom oak dining table, the imported rugs, and the high-end electronics. I told him that everything marked with a red sticker was going into a secure climate-controlled storage facility under my name. Everything without a sticker was to stay exactly where it was. Greg looked around the sprawling, heavily furnished home and let out a low whistle. He told me it would take a massive crew and at least 5 full-size trucks to clear out a house of this magnitude in the timeline I demanded. I told him to double the crew and bring 6 trucks. I was not negotiating on time. The actual extraction began on a crisp Tuesday morning. I stood on the wide front porch holding a mug of black coffee as a convoy of massive white moving trucks rumbled down the quiet street. They parked in a long line along the curb, their air brakes hissing loudly in the tranquil suburban air. A team of 15 professional movers piled out, moving with the kind of synchronized efficiency that I deeply appreciated. Greg approached the porch, handing me a final inventory manifest to sign. I signed my name with the steady hand, handed the clipboard back to him, and stepped aside. The heavy front doors were propped wide open and the invasion began. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of logistics. Men in matching uniforms swarmed the house with moving blankets, industrial plastic wrap, and heavy-duty dollies. I stood in the grand foyer, acting as the supreme floor general. I directed foot traffic, cross-referenced my master inventory list, and watched the physical manifestation of my parents' fake wealth get systematically dismantled. The first major piece to go was the $8,000 custom leather sectional from the formal living room. I watched 2 men wrap it securely in thick, padded blankets and wheel it out the front door. This was the exact sofa where my mother had hosted her prestigious book club, bragging about her exquisite eye for interior design. Next went the solid walnut coffee table, the expensive floor lamps, and the hand-woven Persian rug that tied the room together. Within 2 hours, the grand living room was completely barren. The sound of my own footsteps began to echo sharply against the hardwood floors. Without the heavy, expensive furniture to absorb the sound, the house instantly felt hollow and cold. It felt exactly like the people who lived in it. The crew moved with ruthless speed to the formal dining room. They carefully dismantled the massive mahogany dining table that seated 12. This was the table where we had eaten Thanksgiving dinner just last year, the dinner where my father had given a long-winded speech about the importance of family loyalty while secretly funneling my money to Ashley. I watched without a single ounce of emotion as the movers carried out the matching upholstered chairs, the antique buffet cabinet, and the expensive crystal glassware my mother insisted on displaying behind glass doors. Every single item had been purchased with my corporate bonus 3 years ago. Every single item was now going into a dark storage unit. I directed a separate team upstairs to the bedrooms. I instructed them to strip the rooms down to the carpet. They carried out the heavy oak bed frames, the imported luxury mattresses, the matching dressers, and the expensive bedside tables. I watched them dismantle the custom California king bed in the master suite. My parents had complained for months about their bad backs until I finally relented and bought them the most expensive therapeutic mattress on the market. The movers hauled it down the stairs, leaving the master bedroom looking like an abandoned hotel room. As the days progressed, the house became progressively more skeletal. I did not stop at the furniture. I directed the crew to unmount the massive 70-inch smart televisions from the walls. I had them disconnect the high-end surround sound speakers from the ceiling. I even had them remove the expensive silk curtains from the windows, leaving the bare glass exposed to the glaring street. The illusion of their affluent lifestyle was being packed into cardboard boxes and driven away in large white trucks. By the 5th day of the operation, we tackled the kitchen. This was perhaps the most satisfying extraction of all. When I bought the house, the kitchen was severely outdated. My mother had wept openly, claiming she could not possibly host her country club friends with old stained appliances. I had spent nearly $30,000 upgrading the space. Now, I watched the moving crew disconnect the massive stainless steel Viking refrigerator. I watched them carefully wheel out the commercial-grade double oven and the expensive wine cooler. They wrapped the high-end espresso machine and the professional stand mixer in bubble wrap. When they were finished, the kitchen was a shell. The empty spaces between the cabinets where the luxury appliances used to sit looked like missing teeth. The extraction continued out to the back patio. My parents loved to host lavish summer barbecues, showing off their sprawling outdoor entertaining space. I directed the movers to take the massive cast-iron grill, the expensive teakwood outdoor dining set, the plush patio loungers, and the heavy commercial-grade outdoor heaters. The backyard, once a pristine oasis of suburban luxury, was reduced to a plain, empty slab of concrete and grass. The physical labor of the moving company was impressive, but my emotional detachment was absolute. I did not feel a single pang of guilt as the truck slowly filled with my property. I was simply executing a necessary correction to a deeply flawed system. My family had treated me as a bottomless resource, assuming my loyalty would always override my common sense. They had grossly miscalculated. I was removing every single comfort I had provided, leaving them with exactly what they had earned. As the operation neared its conclusion, the stark reality of the house became impossible to ignore. It was systematically stripped down to the bare, echoing walls. Every footstep rang out loudly, bouncing off the empty ceilings and unadorned windows. The space felt cavernous, stripped of its soul and its warmth. But I was not entirely cruel. I did not leave them with absolutely nothing. I left them with the exact items they had brought into the house 4 years ago, the items they owned before I bailed them out of foreclosure. I directed the movers to retrieve these specific items from the dusty, unfinished basement where my mother had hidden them away out of sheer embarrassment. In the center of the massive, echoing living room, I had the movers place an old, lumpy, incredibly uncomfortable green futon. It sat there, sad and pathetic, a stark contrast to the grand architecture of the room. In the formal dining room where the 12-seat mahogany table used to sit, I had them unfold a cheap, scratched plastic folding table accompanied by 3 mismatched metal folding chairs. It looked like a temporary setup for a garage sale. Finally, I directed a team to Ashley's old bedroom. They had already removed the expensive white vanity, the luxury mattress, and all the designer decor. In the center of the bare room, I had them assemble Ashley's original childhood bed, a squeaky chipped metal frame with a thin, sagging mattress. This was the bed she had slept in before my money upgraded her entire existence. I walked through the house on the final day of the moving operation. The crew had packed their last box, loaded the final truck, and swept the floors clean of any debris. Greg handed me the final manifest, shook my hand, and thanked me for the organized business. I locked the front door behind him and stood alone in the grand foyer. The silence was absolute, heavy, and profound. The house smelled different now, stripped of the expensive fabrics and polished woods. It smelled like empty space and stale air. I walked into the living room and stared at the lumpy green futon sitting alone in the center of the floor. This was the reality of their financial situation. This was what their life actually looked like without my constant, unappreciated intervention. They had built a massive house of cards on the foundation of my hard work, and I had simply pulled out the bottom card. I moved into the kitchen, my shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. I looked at the empty gaps where the stainless steel appliances used to shine. I looked at the bare counters. I opened the pantry and saw only a few boxes of cheap pasta and canned soup they had left behind. They had been dining on my dime, drinking expensive wine and throwing lavish parties, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire lifestyle was a fragile gift they were actively destroying. I walked up the stairs, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. I looked into the master bedroom, now completely empty save for the bare carpet. I looked into Ashley's room, staring at the pathetic metal bed frame sitting in the center of the large space. The contrast was beautiful in its brutal honesty. I was not stealing their home. I was simply returning them to their factory settings. The logistical phase of my operation was officially complete. The assets were secured in storage. The financial bleeding was halted. The physical environment was prepared for their return. I walked back down the stairs and stood by the front door. The house was empty, waiting to deliver its silent, devastating message. I pulled my laptop from my shoulder bag and sat down on the bottom step of the grand staircase. I opened the screen and connected to the cellular hotspot on my phone. The screen cast a pale glow in the dim, echoing foyer. I still had the legal trap to set. I still had the eviction notice to serve and the real estate open house to schedule. The logistics were flawless, but the tactical execution of the final phase required absolute precision. I began typing the final details of the real estate listing, ensuring the property photos showed the house in its former glory, drawing in the most aggressive buyers in the market. I was going to sell this house out from under them, and I was going to do it with the same cold, calculating efficiency they had used to steal my vacation. I closed the laptop, the satisfying snap echoing in the empty hall, entirely ready for the homecoming. I walked with measured, steady steps, my heels clicking sharply against the asphalt. The flashing red and blue lights washed over me, but I did not break my stride. I kept my posture completely rigid, my chin held high, projecting an aura of absolute corporate authority. I was not a frantic victim. I was the rightful property owner arriving to address a simple misunderstanding. As I approached the edge of the driveway, the two officers standing with my family turned to look at me. Richard and Patricia were so consumed by their own hysterical narrative that they did not even register my approach until I was standing less than 10 feet away. Ashley was the first to notice. She looked up from her hands, her mascara running in dark, messy streaks down her sunburned cheeks. Her mouth fell open in a silent, comical shape of utter confusion. Patricia turned around, her eyes widening as she took in my tailored suit and my calm, unbothered expression. "Olivia," she gasped, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? Did you get an alert about the house? Thank God you are here. Someone robbed us blind while we were in Europe." I ignored her completely. I turned my attention directly to the lead officer taking the report. "Excuse me, officer," I said, my voice projecting clearly over Patricia's frantic babbling. "I am Olivia Reynolds. I am the sole legal owner of this property. There has been no robbery here today. I can assure you that no crime has taken place on these premises." The officer lowered his notebook, looking back and forth between my calm demeanor and my parents' chaotic panic. "You are the owner of the house, ma'am. These people are claiming the residence was entirely cleared out by thieves." "That is a lie," Richard shouted, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "We own this house. We have lived here for 20 years. She is our daughter. She is just confused." I did not raise my voice. I simply unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder I had prepared. I extracted the official county deed stamped with the raised seal of the municipality and handed it directly to the officer. "As you can see by this official documentation," I explained smoothly, "this property is owned entirely by an LLC which I control. These individuals are former month-to-month tenants. They have no legal claim to the property. Furthermore, the items they are reporting as stolen were actually my own personal assets. I legally removed my own furniture and appliances from my own property." The officer scrutinized the deed carefully, his eyes tracking the legal descriptions and the clear transfer of ownership dated 3 years ago. He looked back up at Richard, his expression shifting from concerned responder to skeptical investigator. "Sir, according to this deed, she is the legal owner of the property. Are you claiming that the missing furniture belonged to you?" "Yes, of course it belonged to us," Patricia shrieked, stepping forward aggressively. "We picked out every single piece. She just paid for it because we were going through a temporary cash flow issue, but it is our house and our things." "Paying for it means you own it," the second officer stated dryly, clearly losing patience with the dramatic display. I pulled out the thick stack of receipts and invoices from my folder. "I have the purchase records for every single item removed from the home," I told the officers, handing over the top sheet showing the $8,000 living room sectional. I purchased the items. I own the items. I removed the items. There is no burglary here. Richard stared at the receipts in the officer's hand, the reality of the situation finally beginning to pierce through his arrogant delusion. "Olivia, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping from a shout to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Where is all our furniture? Why did you empty the house?" I turned to look at my father. I did not blink. "You told me you could not afford a second ticket for the cruise. You told me the budget was simply too tight. I decided to audit the property maintenance accounts while you were gone to see where we could trim some expenses." I reached into the folder and pulled out the printed credit card statements. The $45,000 balance was highlighted in bright yellow ink. I held the paper up so Richard could see the exact numbers. Imagine my surprise when I found out that my emergency medical credit card was used to purchase luxury suites, premium beverage packages, and $8,000 wedding dresses. "You stole $45,000 from me, Richard. You committed financial fraud." Patricia gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward until she hit the side of the police cruiser. Ashley let out a small, terrified squeak and hid her face against Chase's shoulder. Chase simply looked terrified, slowly realizing that the wealthy family he was marrying into was currently being exposed as a group of fraudulent squatters in front of local law enforcement. "We did not steal anything," Patricia cried out, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "You gave us that card for emergencies. Ashley's wedding is an emergency. We are your family. You have millions of dollars. You do not even need that money." The lead officer sighed heavily, handing the deed back to me. "Ma'am, it sounds like this is a civil dispute over finances and tenant property. It is not a criminal burglary. We cannot arrest someone for moving their own furniture out of their own house." "Wait!" Richard yelled, panic entirely consuming him now. "You cannot just let her do this. We live here. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? We have rights." I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out the formal legally binding eviction notice drafted by my attorney. I handed the document directly to Richard. He took it with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the bold legal text. "You violated the terms of your at-will tenancy by misappropriating property maintenance funds and committing financial fraud against the landlord." I stated clearly, making sure the officers heard every single word. "That is your official 30-day notice to vacate the premises. However, since you no longer have beds, appliances, or a functional kitchen, I strongly suggest you find alternative accommodations immediately." I turned my back on them and looked at the two officers. "Thank you for your time, officers. I apologize that my former tenants wasted city resources on a false burglary report. I have everything handled here." The officers nodded clearly, eager to extract themselves from the messy family drama. They radioed the two officers still inside the house, instructing them to clear out. Within minutes, the police cruisers backed out of the driveway, their flashing lights turning off as they rolled down the quiet suburban street, leaving my family standing alone in the driveway with their mountain of luxury luggage and an empty house waiting behind them. The flashing lights of the police cruisers disappeared around the corner, taking with them the last remaining shred of my parents' manufactured dignity. The heavy suburban silence rushed back in to fill the void, punctuated only by the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower and the rustle of the oak trees lining the street. I stood at the edge of the driveway, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my leather briefcase. A few feet away, my family remained frozen in a chaotic tableau of shock and denial. They were completely surrounded by their mountain of luxury luggage, the expensive designer bags they had gleefully packed for a vacation funded entirely by my stolen money. Their sunburned skin and bright resort wear looked absolutely ridiculous against the stark cold reality of the situation they were now facing. My father was staring down at the legal eviction notice in his trembling hands, as if the bold black ink might magically rearrange itself into a different sentence. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic breaths. My mother stood beside him, her face a pale, ghostly white beneath her fresh tropical tan. The aggressive, entitled energy she had displayed just moments ago when shouting at the police officers had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of sheer panic. She looked up from the eviction notice and locked her eyes on me. The denial was still fighting a desperate battle within her mind. She could not comprehend that the daughter she had treated like a disposable financial resource had just systematically dismantled her entire life. She took a shaky step forward, her designer sandals scraping loudly against the concrete driveway. "Olivia!" She started, her voice cracking in a high, unnatural pitch. "This has gone far enough. The police are gone now. You proved your point. You scared us. Now tell me where our furniture is. Tell me where you put all of our things so we can go get them and put our house back together." I looked at her, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "You are still not listening to the facts," I said, my voice projecting a calm, clinical authority. "You do not own any furniture. You do not own a house to put it in. Every single item that was removed from this property belonged to me. I simply transported my own assets to a secure climate-controlled storage facility. They will remain there until I decide what to do with them. You are not getting anything back." My mother's hands curled into tight, trembling fists at her sides. The reality of the empty house was finally beginning to penetrate her deep layers of delusion. "You cannot do this to us," she screamed, the sound echoing harshly down the quiet street. "We are your parents. We raised you. You are going to bring our furniture back right now, and you are going to let us inside to unpack our bags. You have millions of dollars, Olivia. You do not need to do this over a stupid credit card." "A stupid credit card," I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy, humid air. I felt a cold, focused energy radiating through my veins. "You stole $45,000 from me. You used a medical emergency account to fund a luxury vacation premium beverage packages, VIP casino cabanas, and custom wedding dresses. You exploited my trust and weaponized my demanding career against me, assuming I would be too busy to audit the accounts. That is not a simple mistake. That is deliberate, calculated financial fraud." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to them, making sure they heard every single syllable of what I was about to say. "The furniture being in storage is the absolute least of your problems right now. First thing tomorrow morning, my attorney is filing a massive civil lawsuit against both of you for the misappropriated funds. But more importantly, I have officially reported every single charge from the cruise line, the bridal boutique, and the Las Vegas resorts as fraudulent to the bank." My father looked up from the eviction paper, his eyes wide with a new, distinct kind of terror. He had worked in corporate management for decades before his business failed. He understood exactly what the word fraud meant when applied to a major financial institution. "Olivia, no," he choked out, dropping the eviction notice onto the driveway as he reached a hand out toward me. "You cannot involve the bank. You cannot file a formal fraud report. Do you have any idea what they will do to us? We will face criminal charges. I could go to prison. You are talking about federal wire fraud and identity theft." "I am fully aware of the legal definitions of the crimes you committed," I replied, my tone completely unyielding. "I provided the bank's fraud investigation department with the exact dates, times, and merchant locations of your theft. I also provided them with documentation proving that neither of you experienced any medical emergencies that would authorize the use of that specific credit line. The bank is going to pursue you for the full $45,000. They are going to freeze your remaining accounts. They are going to audit your financial history. And yes, they will very likely press criminal charges. You did not just steal from your daughter. You defrauded a national financial institution." "See, sir." The absolute finality of my words struck them like a physical blow. My mother let out a small, breathless whimper and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the magnitude of her actions crashed down upon her. She had spent her entire adult life obsessing over her pristine social image, terrified of what her wealthy country club friends might think of her. Now she was facing not only immediate homelessness, but the very real prospect of a highly public, deeply humiliating criminal trial. My father stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the side of Ashley's massive luxury suitcase to keep himself from collapsing onto the concrete. He looked at me with a pathetic, pleading expression, desperately searching my face for any trace of the obedient, desperate for approval daughter they had manipulated for so many years. He found absolutely nothing but cold, analytical detachment. I had closed the Bank of Olivia permanently, and I had thrown away the vault key. Ashley had been standing frozen near the back of the driveway, clutching her iced coffee cup in one hand and her smartphone in the other. She had watched the entire confrontation unfold in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the rapid, catastrophic collapse of her completely subsidized reality. She had spent her entire life floating on a cushion of stolen money entirely insulated from consequence or hardship. Now the cushion was gone and she was in a freefall. Suddenly the shock broke, and an intense feral rage took over her features. Her face turned a mottled, furious red, clashing violently with her peeling sunburn. She dropped her iced coffee cup onto the driveway, the plastic cracking and spilling brown liquid across the concrete. "You ruined my life!" Ashley screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying a hysterical, unhinged edge. "You planned all of this just to ruin my wedding and destroy my happiness because you are a jealous, miserable, boring loser?" Before anyone could stop her, Ashley lunged forward. She charged across the driveway, her arms outstretched, intending to physically attack me. Her expensive designer sandals slapped loudly against the pavement as she closed the distance between us. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I simply planted my weight, kept my eyes locked on her furious face, and executed a calm, perfectly timed sidestep to the right. Ashley, carrying too much forward momentum and completely blinded by her own rage, missed me entirely. Her foot caught the edge of my father's discarded travel bag, and she stumbled hard, her arms flailing wildly as she crashed down onto the hard concrete of the driveway. She landed on her hands and knees, scraping the skin off her palms and tearing a massive hole in her expensive flowing resort dress. She let out a loud, dramatic wail of pain, sitting back on her heels and glaring up at me with tears of absolute fury streaming down her face. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary copy of the legal eviction notice. I crouched down slightly and placed the crisp white paper directly onto the concrete, right in front of her scraped knees. "You have exactly 30 days to get your cheap, pathetic metal bed frame and your old green futon out of my property," I told her, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet driveway. "However, you might want to start packing up your trash right now. The real estate open house starts in exactly 2 hours. I have a team of luxury real estate agents arriving at noon to show the property to several prospective all-cash buyers. I will not have you or your garbage interfering with my property sale." Ashley stared at the eviction notice on the ground, her chest heaving with ragged sobs. She looked up at her parents, waiting for them to rush to her defense, waiting for them to fix the situation and put her back on her pedestal. But my mother was still weeping into her hands, and my father was staring blankly at the ground, completely broken by the reality of the impending fraud case. No one was coming to save her. Throughout this entire explosive confrontation, Chad had been standing near the back of the driveway, completely silent. He was still wearing his bright tropical polo shirt and holding his expensive sunglasses, but his relaxed vacation demeanor had completely evaporated. He was staring at the scene in front of him with an expression of profound, dawning horror. Chad was not a particularly ambitious or intelligent man, but he understood basic survival. He had proposed to Ashley primarily because he believed she came from massive, unlimited generational wealth. He had gladly quit his part-time job managing inventory because he assumed his wealthy future-in-laws would bankroll his lifestyle pay for his lavish wedding and set him up in a comfortable suburban house. He had spent the last 2 weeks drinking premium champagne and lounging in a luxury suite, entirely convinced he had successfully secured his financial future. Now he was standing in a driveway watching his future father-in-law face federal fraud charges, watching his future mother-in-law weep over her eviction, and watching his fiancée scream on the concrete after attempting to physically assault the actual owner of the wealth he thought he was marrying into. Chad took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the pile of luxury luggage. He looked at Ashley, who was still sitting on the ground sobbing, and then he looked at the massive, empty colonial house looming behind her. "Wait," Chad said, his voice cutting through Ashley's crying. His tone was low, thick with absolute disbelief and growing disgust. "You told me your parents owned this place. You told me they were rich. You told me they paid for the cruise out of their retirement fund. Ashley scrambled to her feet, wiping her scraped hands on her ruined designer dress. Panic immediately replaced her anger as she realized she was losing her grip on Chad. "Baby, please listen to me," she begged, reaching her hands out toward him. "It is just a huge misunderstanding. My sister is just being crazy. My parents are going to fix this. They are going to call their lawyers and get everything sorted out. We are still going to have our perfect wedding." Chad took another step back, physically recoiling from her extended hands. He looked at her with a level of absolute disgust that I had never seen before. He looked at the scraped knees, the ruined dress, the running makeup, and the desperate lying expression on her face. He saw right through the illusion. He saw the bankrupt, fraudulent reality she had been desperately trying to hide. "There is no money," Chad said flatly, stating the fact, as if he was finally waking up from a long, confusing dream. "Your parents do not own a house. They do not have a retirement fund. They stole a credit card to pay for our vacation. You are completely broke." "No, Chad, please," Ashley shrieked, taking a step toward him. "We can figure this out. We love each other. I am not marrying into a family of homeless criminals," Chad said, his voice devoid of any warmth or affection. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and tapped the screen a few times. He did not look at Ashley again. He did not look at my parents. He simply turned his back on them and walked to the end of the driveway, standing near the curb with his arms crossed over his chest. Ashley stood in the center of the driveway, her mouth opening and closing as she stared at the back of the man who had just abandoned her. She looked utterly lost, completely stripped of her arrogant confidence and her fake subsidized identity. She turned to look at my parents, but they were entirely consumed by their own impending legal and financial destruction. 10 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up to the curb. Chad opened the rear door, climbed inside without a single backward glance, and shut the door firmly. The car drove away, disappearing down the quiet suburban street, taking Ashley's fake wealthy future with it. I stood in the driveway watching the car leave, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The logistical operation was a complete, flawless success. The broken system had been dismantled, the leaks had been permanently sealed, and the liabilities had been removed from my ledger. I turned around, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked to my car. I did not say another word to the weeping, broken people standing among their stolen luggage. They had exactly what they earned, and I had my life back. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle and firmly pulled the heavy door shut, instantly cutting off the stifling humidity of the suburban afternoon. The quiet interior of my car enveloped me like a protective sanctuary. I pressed the ignition button, feeling the smooth, reliable hum of the engine waking up beneath my hands. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. There was absolutely no reason to look back. The massive colonial estate, the carefully manicured lawn, and the weeping figures standing helplessly among their imported luxury suitcases all faded into the background as I accelerated down the tree-lined street. I drove toward the city with a profound sense of clarity guiding my every movement. The 45-minute commute from the suburbs to my downtown penthouse felt entirely different today. The heavy, suffocating burden of familial obligation that had weighed down my shoulders for my entire adult life was gone completely. I watched the sprawling suburban neighborhoods slowly transition into the towering glass and steel architecture of the city skyline. I felt like a surgeon who had just successfully amputated a deeply infected limb. The procedure was undeniably drastic, but the patient was finally going to survive. I pulled into the secured underground parking garage of my high-rise building and parked in my designated space. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent and smooth. When I unlocked the door to my penthouse, the cool, purified air greeted me with a comforting familiarity. My home was an absolute reflection of my own mind. It was organized, immaculate, and entirely free of unnecessary clutter. I placed my leather briefcase on the entryway console table and walked directly into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling urban landscape, allowing my nervous system to fully recalibrate after the morning confrontation. I knew the silence would not last long. My family was fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat gracefully. They operated entirely on the currency of social perception, and they were about to launch a desperate campaign to protect their shattered image. My prediction proved accurate less than 2 hours later. I was sitting at my dining table reviewing a preliminary contract for a new corporate client when my smartphone screen illuminated with a sudden, relentless barrage of notifications. The alerts poured in simultaneously across multiple applications. My text message inbox began to fill rapidly with concerned and confused inquiries from extended family members. My social media applications displayed dozens of tags, mentions, and direct messages. The digital onslaught had officially begun. I set down my pen, took a slow sip of water, and picked up my device. I unlocked the screen and navigated directly to Patricia's primary social media profile. I knew my mother better than anyone, and I knew exactly how she would attempt to manipulate the narrative to secure maximum sympathy from her affluent peers. Patricia had posted a lengthy, hysterical public statement, accompanied by a photograph of herself and Richard standing on the sidewalk in front of the empty house. The photograph was heavily filtered to emphasize her tear-streaked face and her trembling posture. The written caption was a masterpiece of creative fiction and manipulative gaslighting. She claimed that she and my father had returned from a modest, relaxing vacation, only to find that their oldest daughter had suffered a severe, unprecedented mental breakdown. She wrote that I had completely lost my grip on reality due to the extreme pressures of my corporate career. According to her fabricated narrative, my supposed mental instability had caused me to illegally break into their beloved family home, change the locks in a fit of paranoid delusion, and hire a rogue moving company to steal every single piece of their precious furniture. Patricia tagged dozens of her country club associates, her bridge group members, and the leaders of her various neighborhood committees. She begged for prayers and legal advice, portraying herself as the devastated, heartbroken mother of a severely ill daughter who had maliciously destroyed their sanctuary. She claimed they were currently huddled in a cheap hotel room, terrified of what my unstable mind might push me to do next. The comment section below her post was already exploding with outraged reactions from the suburban elite. Women who had attended her lavish dinner parties were typing out paragraphs of absolute shock and horror. They offered my parents a place to stay, condemned my terrible behavior, and suggested that I needed to be institutionalized immediately for my own safety. I swiped away from my mother's profile and navigated to Ashley's page. My sister had taken a decidedly different, yet equally predictable approach to the smear campaign. Ashley had uploaded a series of videos to her public story, filming herself sitting on the edge of the lumpy green futon I had left in the center of the empty living room. Her makeup was artfully smudged to convey deep emotional distress while maintaining her preferred aesthetic appeal. She spoke directly into the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured trauma. She told her thousands of followers that her jealous, bitter older sister had intentionally ruined her life out of pure spite. Ashley claimed that I had always resented her happiness and her upcoming wedding. She falsely stated that I had manipulated my way onto the property deed, using shady corporate loopholes just to throw her out on the street. She painted me as a cold, calculating monster who hated seeing her own family experience joy. The sheer volume of the digital attack was staggering. My extended family members, aunts and uncles who had always favored my parents, were sending me angry text messages demanding that I return the stolen furniture and seek psychiatric help. They called me selfish, cruel, and mentally disturbed. My parents had effectively weaponized their entire social network against me within a matter of hours. They believed that by striking first and creating a loud, dramatic spectacle, they could completely bury the truth beneath an avalanche of manufactured sympathy. They assumed I would shrink back, delete my social media accounts in shame, and attempt to quietly defend myself to deaf ears. They calculated that the immense social pressure would force me to surrender, hand back the keys to the house, and beg for their forgiveness to restore my own reputation. They miscalculated entirely. I did not feel a single ounce of panic as I read the vicious comments and the demanding text messages. I did not feel the urge to draft a long emotional response defending my character or explaining my side of the story. Engaging in a public shouting match would only validate their premise that I was acting erratically. Instead, I operated with the same ruthless logistical efficiency that had allowed me to dismantle their house. I closed my social media applications and opened my encrypted digital archives. I possessed the ultimate undeniable weapon against their smear campaign. I had absolute documented truth. I created a new secure folder on my cloud storage drive. I titled the folder simply and clinically. I selected the official county deed showing my limited liability company as the sole owner of the property for the past 3 years. I uploaded the formal tenancy agreement that my parents had signed, which explicitly detailed their status as at-will tenants living rent-free in my house. Next, I uploaded the comprehensive purchase receipts and delivery invoices for every single piece of furniture, art, and appliances that I had removed from the property. These documents proved definitively that I had not stolen anything. I had simply relocated assets that were legally registered in my name. The real estate and ownership documents were merely the defensive shield. I still needed to deploy the offensive strike. I accessed my banking portal and downloaded the most recent unedited statement for the emergency medical credit card. I used a digital highlighting tool to illuminate the $45,000 balance. I placed bright yellow markers over the specific charges from the bridal boutique, the luxury casino resorts in Las Vegas, and the premium cruise line upgrades. I uploaded this highlighted banking statement to the cloud folder. Finally, I uploaded the official police report number and the formal fraud investigation filing I had submitted to the bank earlier that week. These documents transformed their narrative of a family dispute into a documented case of severe financial crimes. I reviewed the contents of the cloud folder to ensure every piece of evidence was clearly legible, legally sound, and utterly indisputable. There were no emotional statements attached to the files, no angry paragraphs defending my actions. The documents spoke entirely for themselves. They painted a stark mathematical picture of a family who had secretly sold their home to their daughter to avoid foreclosure, lived lavishly on her dime, and then committed blatant credit card fraud to fund a luxury vacation. With the digital portfolio complete, I generated a shareable link. I did not post this link on my own public profile. I did not want to engage in a messy, broad-spectrum broadcast. I needed targeted, highly effective distribution. I needed to strike directly at the central nervous system of my mother's social hierarchy. I opened my contacts and selected 3 specific individuals. The first was my Aunt Diane, my father's older sister, who served as the undisputed chief communicator for our entire extended family tree. The second was Beverly, the current sitting president of my mother's prestigious country club. The third was the head of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, a woman notorious for her aggressive enforcement of community standards and her insatiable appetite for local scandal. I drafted a single identical message to all 3 women. The text was polite, professional, and entirely devoid of emotional language. I wrote that I understood there was currently a significant amount of confusion regarding the situation at the suburban estate. I explained that because my parents were experiencing a severe financial crisis and facing active federal fraud investigations, they were unfortunately struggling to process reality. I stated that to prevent any further spread of false information regarding my property or my professional reputation, I was providing the official legal and financial documentation of the events. I concluded the message by wishing them well and pasted the secure cloud link at the bottom. I pressed send on all 3 messages simultaneously. I placed my smartphone face down on the dining table, walked into my kitchen, and poured myself a second glass of cold water. The execution phase was officially complete. I did not need to actively monitor the resulting explosion. I knew exactly how the social physics of their affluent, gossip-driven circle operated. The truth would not just walk through their community, it would tear through it with the destructive force of a hurricane. The silence in my penthouse lasted for exactly 42 minutes. Then the vibrations on my table began again. I picked up the device and watched the social implosion unfold in real time. Aunt Diane had clearly opened the link, read the credit card statements, and immediately forwarded the entire portfolio to every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our family network. The aggressive, condemning text messages I had been receiving from relatives abruptly stopped. They were swiftly replaced by messages of profound shock, horrified apologies, and stunned disbelief. My cousins, who had previously defended Ashley, were now expressing absolute disgust at her bridal boutique charges. My uncles were demanding to know why Richard had hidden his foreclosure from the family and stooped to stealing from his own daughter. The reaction within my mother's country club circle was even more devastating. Beverly, the club president, did not keep the documents private. In that particular social stratosphere, financial fraud was considered the ultimate unforgivable sin. The illusion of wealth was paramount, and my parents had just been exposed as completely bankrupt fraudsters living on their child's charity. Within an hour, the comment section under my mother's dramatic public post began to shift violently. The women who had been offering prayers and support were suddenly asking pointed questions about the luxury cruise charges and the property deed. They demanded to know why she had lied to them about owning the home. They asked how she could possibly justify using a medical credit card to pay for her daughter's wedding dresses while claiming to be a victim. I refreshed the page and watched the digital panic set in. My mother was frantically attempting to delete the negative comments as quickly as they appeared, but the sheer volume of the backlash was completely overwhelming her. People were posting screenshots of the credit card statement directly into her comment section, highlighting the fraudulent charges for everyone to see. The narrative of my supposed mental breakdown was entirely obliterated by the cold, hard mathematics of her theft. Her friends were not just turning away from her, they were actively turning on her, furious that she had attempted to manipulate their sympathy using such a blatant, easily disprovable lie. 10 minutes later, I refreshed the page one more time. The post was gone. Patricia had completely deleted the entire hysterical statement. A quick search revealed that she had deactivated her social media profile entirely, pulling the plug on her digital existence in a desperate, futile attempt to hide from the inescapable humiliation. I navigated over to Ashley's page. The crying videos on her story had been abruptly taken down. The comment sections on her recent luxury vacation photos were flooded with people mocking her fake wealth and calling out her complicity in the credit card fraud. She had restricted her comments, but the damage was permanently sealed into the public record. My phone screen lit up with an incoming call from my father. I watched his name flash on the display. I knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to scream at me for ruining their reputation. He wanted to beg me to take the documents down. He wanted to negotiate a surrender now that his entire social and professional world had seen the undeniable proof of his crimes. I let the phone ring until the call went to voicemail. I had absolutely nothing left to say to him. I blocked his number, followed immediately by my mother's number and my sister's number. I blocked Aunt Diane. I blocked the extended family members who had initially attacked me, and I turned my phone on silent. The smear campaign they had launched to destroy my life had served only to completely and permanently obliterate theirs. They had built a massive, intricate house of lies to protect their fragile egos, and I had simply provided the community with the blueprints showing exactly how fake the foundation was. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse and looked out at the vibrant, glowing city below. I felt a deep, profound sense of tranquility settling into my bones. The heavy, toxic anchors of my past had finally been cut loose, sinking to the bottom of the ocean of their own making. I was completely free to move forward, unburdened and entirely in control of my own highly efficient, beautifully quiet life. The quiet did not mean an absence of information. While I had severed all direct communication with my parents and my sister, the ripples of their financial collapse continued to reach me through the highly interconnected network of downtown commerce. The first major shockwave hit exactly 3 days after the driveway confrontation. I was sitting at my desk reviewing quarterly projections when my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of an elite, highly exclusive event venue located just outside the city. It was the exact location Ashley had bragged about booking for her upcoming wedding. I answered the call with my standard professional greeting. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the senior event coordinator. Her voice was strained, vibrating with a tightly suppressed panic. She explained that she was calling regarding the final non-refundable payment for Ashley's luxury wedding reception. The payment had been scheduled to process automatically that morning, but the credit card on file had been declined. The card, of course, was the emergency medical line I had completely frozen and flagged for fraud. I listened calmly as the coordinator explained that she had tried to reach Ashley and my parents, but all of their phones were either disconnected or going straight to voicemail. She had found my corporate contact information listed on the original authorization forms they had forged using my account details. I did not raise my voice. I did not express any anger toward the coordinator. I simply informed her with absolute clinical detachment that the credit card she had on file had been used to commit federal fraud. I told her that the individuals who had booked the venue possessed absolutely no financial assets, no home, and no means to pay for a luxury event. I advised her to cancel the reservation immediately and release the date to another client. The coordinator gasped softly, thanked me for my honesty, and ended the call. Within the hour, the cancellation of the wedding of the season became official. For Ashley, the loss of the venue was the final fatal blow to the illusion she had spent her entire adult life constructing. The wedding was supposed to be her ultimate coronation. It was the grand, highly publicized event where she planned to permanently secure her status among the wealthy elite she so desperately wanted to impress. Without my stolen money to fund the extravagant floral arrangements, the premium open bar, and the multi-course gourmet dinner, the entire event instantly evaporated into thin air. She could not simply scale back or find a cheaper alternative. The vendors, having caught wind of the bounced payments and the swirling rumors of credit card fraud, dropped her immediately. The florists, the caterers, and the luxury transportation companies all canceled their contracts, refusing to do business with a family currently under investigation by a major national bank. The sudden catastrophic collapse of the wedding was the exact catalyst Chad needed to finalize his exit strategy. He had already abandoned Ashley in the driveway during the eviction, but she had spent the last 3 days desperately trying to win him back. She had been sending him frantic text messages from a cheap motel room she was sharing with our parents, promising him that the financial issues were just a temporary setback. She swore that my parents would hire expensive lawyers, sue me for the house, and restore their wealthy lifestyle. Chad, however, possessed enough basic survival instinct to recognize a sinking ship. He had seen the empty house. He had seen the police officers. He had seen the absolute disgust on the faces of my parents' former country club friends. Their final interaction took place in the parking lot of the motel where my parents had retreated. I learned the details later through the relentless, highly accurate gossip network of my mother's former friends. Ashley had waited for Chad by his car, wearing the same ruined designer resort dress she had torn during her failed attack on me in the driveway. She looked exhausted, sunburned, and completely stripped of her usual arrogant glow. She begged him to stay, grabbing his arm and crying that they could just go to a courthouse and get married quietly. Chad looked down at her with an expression of profound, unshielded disgust. He did not see a beautiful, wealthy bride anymore. He saw a broke, unemployed woman with no assets, no valuable skills, and a family facing serious criminal charges. He pulled his arm away from her grasp, stepping back as if her sudden poverty might be contagious. He looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the cold, brutal truth she had been avoiding her entire life. He told her he had only proposed because he thought she came from money. He said he had absolutely no intention of marrying a woman who lived in a motel and whose parents were essentially homeless criminals. He told her she brought absolutely nothing to the table without my wallet to back her up. He got into his car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving the golden child standing alone in the humid parking lot, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire subsidized future disappeared down the highway. Stripped of her fiancé, her luxury wedding, and her endless supply of stolen funds, Ashley was finally forced to collide with the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. For her entire life, my parents had insulated her from every single consequence. They had funded her gap years, paid off her credit cards, and repeatedly assured her that she was too special to participate in the traditional workforce. She had built her entire identity around being a lifestyle influencer, posting highly curated photographs of expensive brunches and designer shopping bags that I had unknowingly paid for. But social media influence requires capital, and her capital had dried up completely. With my parents facing aggressive legal action from the bank and struggling to secure a modest apartment with their ruined credit, they could no longer afford to support her. The golden child was entirely on her own. Ashley quickly discovered that a resume consisting solely of incomplete college courses and self-proclaimed influencer status held absolutely zero value in the competitive corporate job market. She applied for dozens of high-paying marketing and public relations positions, expecting to be handed a lucrative salary based purely on her charming personality. She was unceremoniously rejected from every single one. Corporate hiring managers saw right through her complete lack of actual work experience and her profound inability to answer basic professional questions. Desperation eventually overpowered her massive inflated ego. Facing eviction from the cheap short-term rental she had managed to secure with the last of her pawned jewelry, Ashley was forced to lower her standards. She could no longer afford to hold out for a glamorous position. She needed an immediate paycheck just to keep the lights on and buy groceries. The only place willing to hire someone with her complete lack of professional history was a massive, high-volume fast fashion retail store located in the busiest, most crowded shopping mall in the suburbs. The transition from pampered subsidized socialite to minimum wage retail employee was a brutal systematic dismantling of Ashley's deeply ingrained arrogance. Her new reality consisted of early morning shifts, restrictive uniform policies, and the agonizing physical labor of standing on her feet for 8 hours a day. She was no longer the most important person in the room. She was just another replaceable employee, wearing a cheap polyester lanyard with her name printed on it. Her days were spent endlessly folding discarded clothing, reorganizing messy display tables, and cleaning out the chaotic fitting rooms left behind by inconsiderate shoppers. The ultimate humiliation arrived exactly 1 month into her new retail career. It occurred on a busy Saturday afternoon. Ashley was working the primary cash register, mechanically scanning items and bagging cheap synthetic garments. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unauthorized ponytail, and her hands were dry and cracked from breaking down cardboard inventory boxes in the stockroom. The line of waiting customers was exceptionally long, and her manager was currently hovering nearby, reprimanding her for working too slowly. Ashley called the next customer forward, keeping her eyes focused downward on the barcode scanner. A woman stepped up to the counter and placed a large pile of clothing down. When Ashley finally looked up to state the total price, she froze completely. Standing directly across from her was Lauren, one of the wealthiest, most prominent women from my mother's former country club circle. Lauren was the exact kind of affluent, judgmental woman Ashley had spent her entire life trying to impress. Lauren's daughter had been one of Ashley's designated bridesmaids before the wedding catastrophically collapsed. The recognition was immediate and devastating. Lauren looked at Ashley, taking in the cheap retail uniform, the exhausted posture, and the glaring fluorescent lights illuminating her profound fall from grace. There was no sympathy in Lauren's expression. There was only a cold, calculating amusement. The country club women already knew everything about the credit card fraud and the stolen house. They knew my parents were currently drowning in legal fees and living in a tiny apartment on the wrong side of the city. Now Lauren was witnessing the golden child manually scanning clearance rack t-shirts for minimum wage. "Ashley," Lauren said, her voice carrying clearly over the noise of the busy store. She made absolutely no effort to keep the interaction discreet. "I hardly recognized you in that uniform. I suppose we will not be seeing you at the club's summer gala this year. Are you working here full-time now?" Ashley's face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. She could feel the eyes of her manager and the surrounding customers locking onto her. She wanted to lie. She wanted to claim she was just helping out a friend or doing research for a new marketing campaign or any of the hundreds of creative excuses she used to invent. But she could not. The stark reality of her situation stripped away any remaining ability to construct a convincing illusion. She was holding a plastic scanning gun, earning barely enough money to pay her rent, and facing the woman who represented the life she had permanently lost. Yes, Ashley whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the word. She quickly looked back down at the cash register, desperately trying to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. Your total is $42. Lauren smiled a sharp, predatory smile. She opened her designer handbag, pulled out a sleek premium credit card, and slid it across the counter. It is such a shame about the wedding, Lauren said, twisting the knife with practiced country club cruelty. But I suppose it is good that you are finally learning the value of a hard-earned dollar. Have a nice day, dear. Ashley handed back the receipt, her hands shaking violently. As Lauren walked away, Ashley had to turn away from the register and hide her face behind the computer monitor. She was officially publicly ruined. The story of her bagging cheap clothes at the local mall would circulate through their entire former social network before the sun went down. She was no longer the beautiful, successful daughter of wealthy suburbanites. She was the fraudulent, abandoned retail worker paying the price for her family's incredible greed. I learned about this interaction the same way I learned about Chad leaving her. The gossip network operated with a brutal, relentless efficiency. When I received the message detailing Ashley's public humiliation at the cash register, I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I simply felt the same quiet, steady peace that had been guiding me for weeks. The scales of justice had finally perfectly balanced themselves. The family that had demanded I fund their illusions while treating me with absolute contempt had finally been forced to construct their own reality. I placed my phone back down on my pristine dining table, turned my attention back to the corporate contracts waiting for my approval, and continued to build my beautiful, completely unbothered life. 2 weeks passed in that state of uninterrupted tranquility before the legal machinery I had set into motion demanded my attention once again. The peace I felt in my penthouse was absolute, but my logistical operation was not entirely complete. I had stopped the financial bleeding and removed them from my property, but the matter of the stolen $45,000 remained unresolved. The National Bank had conducted a thorough, rapid investigation into the disputed charges. Armed with the overwhelming evidence I had provided, including the clear pattern of geographical disparity and the specific nature of the luxury purchases, the bank's fraud department concluded their inquiry with ruthless efficiency. They officially classified the charges as unauthorized and fraudulent. Because the amount exceeded the threshold for grand larceny and wire fraud, the bank's legal department was preparing to hand the case over to federal prosecutors. My parents were no longer just dealing with an angry daughter. They were standing directly in the crosshairs of a massive financial institution that prosecuted credit card fraud with zero tolerance. My attorney Bennett called me into his office on a crisp Thursday morning to discuss our strategy. Bennett was a brilliant, highly aggressive corporate litigator who treated emotional family disputes with the same cold, calculating precision he applied to hostile corporate takeovers. I sat across from his massive glass desk, looking out at the panoramic view of the downtown skyline. Bennett informed me that the bank was ready to press felony charges. If the case went to the federal level, my parents would face mandatory prison sentences. A conviction would ensure they spent the next several years behind bars. I listened to this information without a single flinch. However, my highly analytical brain instantly recognized a massive flaw in allowing the federal prosecution to proceed. If my parents were incarcerated, their ability to generate income would drop to absolute zero. They would never be able to repay the $45,000 they had stolen from me. I did not care about saving them from the humiliation of a prison sentence, but I cared deeply about balancing my own financial ledger. I instructed Bennett to contact the bank's legal department and negotiate a civil settlement. I offered to personally cover the outstanding balance with the bank to close the active fraud dispute on their end, provided that my parents signed a legally binding ironclad contract transferring that exact debt directly to me. I wanted them to owe me the money, and I wanted them legally bound to a suffocating repayment plan. Bennett smiled a sharp, predatory smile. He understood exactly what I was doing. I was not forgiving the debt. I was simply purchasing the debt so I could act as their personal, unrelenting collection agency. Bennett drafted the settlement paperwork over the weekend. The terms were deliberately brutal. The contract required my parents to sign a formal notarized admission of theft. They had to legally confess on paper that they knowingly and maliciously stole the funds using a medical emergency account for unauthorized luxury travel and wedding expenses. Furthermore, the contract mandated a strict monthly repayment schedule that would automatically garnish a significant percentage of any future wages or Social Security benefits they received. If they missed a single payment, the contract stipulated that I had the immediate right to hand the signed confession directly over to the district attorney and revive the criminal charges. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. Bennett summoned my parents to his downtown law firm the following Tuesday. I arrived early, taking a seat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany conference table. The room was designed to intimidate, featuring dark wood paneling, heavy leather chairs, and a stunning vertigo-inducing view of the city below. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and kept my posture perfectly rigid. I placed my hands flat on the table, feeling the cool, polished wood beneath my palms, and waited for the arrival of my debtors. When the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open, the physical transformation of my parents was genuinely shocking. Just a few weeks ago, they had stood on the front porch of my suburban estate, radiating arrogant, subsidized wealth. The people who walked into the conference room now looked like entirely different individuals. The stress of the public social implosion, combined with the terrifying reality of impending homelessness and federal prosecution, had aged them a decade in less than a month. My mother walked in first. The expensive designer resort wear and perfectly coiffed blonde hair were gone. She wore a plain, remarkably cheap beige blouse and wrinkled black trousers. Her posture, usually so proud and dismissive, was hunched and defeated. Her skin looked gray, and the dark circles under her eyes indicated weeks of profound sleeplessness. My father followed closely behind her, carrying a battered plastic folder. He looked hollowed out. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his suit jacket hung loosely off his shoulders. They looked exactly like people who had lost absolutely everything. They took their seats on the opposite side of the massive table. They did not look at me. They stared down at the polished mahogany wood, their hands trembling slightly as they placed their plastic folder on the table. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. Bennett walked into the room, exuding a sharp, unyielding authority. He did not offer them coffee or water. He did not engage in any pleasantries. He sat down next to me, opened his leather briefcase, and pulled out the thick stack of settlement documents. He placed them precisely in the center of the table and leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Bennett began the meeting by outlining the exact severity of their situation. He spoke in a crisp, authoritative tone, breaking down the specific criminal statutes they had violated. He explained how the bank's fraud investigation had concluded that they committed grand larceny and felony wire fraud. He detailed the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for those specific crimes in our state. He made sure they understood that they were currently standing on the absolute precipice of a federal prison sentence. I watched my mother's face as Bennett spoke. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. She opened her mouth, attempting to deploy her usual tactics of manipulation and denial. She started to say that there had been a misunderstanding, that they always intended to pay the money back, and that I was exaggerating the situation to punish them. Bennett cut her off instantly. He raised his hand, silencing her with a single sharp gesture. He informed her that the time for storytelling had permanently expired. He pointed to the documents in the center of the table and explained that they had exactly one option to avoid a criminal trial. He laid out the terms of the settlement I had authorized. He explained the mandatory monthly repayment schedule, the automatic wage garnishment, and the absolute requirement to sign the written confession of their theft. My father reached a shaking hand out and pulled the documents toward him. He read through the first page, his eyes scanning the harsh legal language. When he reached the section detailing the admission of guilt, he stopped reading. He looked up at Bennett, his face completely pale. He asked if the confession was truly necessary. He pleaded that signing a document calling himself a thief would ruin his chances of ever securing a respectable management position again. I finally broke my silence. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. I looked directly into my father's eyes and told him that his reputation was already ruined. I reminded him that his former country club friends had seen the credit card statements. I stated that signing the confession was not a negotiation tactic. It was a mandatory requirement for my mercy. I told him that if he did not sign the paper right now, Bennett would immediately dial the district attorney's office and forward the bank's fraud findings for federal prosecution. My mother began to weep softly, the sound muffled behind her hands. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and begged me to reconsider the harshness of the terms. She pleaded that they had nothing left. She said they had been living in a cheap motel for weeks, eating fast food and rapidly running out of the small amount of cash they had salvaged from their personal accounts. She asked how I could possibly subject my own flesh and blood to such a punishing, suffocating financial arrangement. I did not blink. I did not offer her a tissue. I simply looked at her and replied that I was treating them with the exact same level of compassion they had shown me when they stole my $15,000 emergency fund to upgrade a luxury cruise suite. I reminded her that while I was working 80-hour weeks to keep a roof over their heads, she was swiping my medical credit card at a bridal boutique. I told her that this settlement was the absolute definition of fairness. They consumed $45,000 of my hard-earned wealth, and they were going to spend the rest of their natural lives paying it back dollar by grueling dollar. The reality of their cornered position finally settled over them. They had no money to hire a defense attorney. They had no wealthy friends left to bail them out. They had absolutely no leverage. The only alternative to signing the humiliating confession was wearing a prison uniform. My father picked up the heavy brass pen resting on the table. His hand shook so violently that he could barely grip the metal barrel. He flipped to the signature page of the confession document. He hesitated for one agonizing second, taking a deep, shuddering breath, and then he signed his name. He passed the pen to my mother. She sobbed openly as she took the pen, her tears falling directly onto the crisp white paper as she scribbled her signature next to his. They initialed every page of the repayment agreement, legally binding themselves to a lifetime of financial servitude. Bennett collected the signed documents, verifying that every signature and initial was in the correct place. He placed the papers back into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a loud final click. He looked at my parents and informed them that the meeting was officially concluded. They were dismissed. They stood up from the table, slowly moving like people who were physically injured. They gathered their cheap plastic folder and walked toward the heavy glass doors. They did not look back at me. They did not say goodbye. They walked out of the conference room, stepping into an entirely new, bleak reality that they had built entirely with their own greed. With the legal settlement executed and the threat of prison hanging securely over their heads, my parents were forced to drastically alter their living situation. The cheap motel they had been occupying was draining their remaining cash reserves too quickly. Without my massive suburban estate to house them, and without my credit card to fund their lifestyle, they had to descend into the lowest tier of the local rental market. Because my father had virtually no income and his credit score was severely damaged by his previous business failures, no reputable landlord in the affluent suburbs would approve their application. They were forced to look on the far, undesirable side of the city, miles away from their former country club and their high-end shopping districts. They eventually secured a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment in a massive, poorly maintained concrete complex located right next to a noisy industrial park. I learned about their new living conditions through the necessary address updates they had to provide to Bennett for the legal repayment processing. The contrast between their new environment and the luxury they had stolen from me was the ultimate manifestation of poetic justice. The apartment complex was notorious for its peeling linoleum floors, its unreliable heating systems, and the constant rattling noise of heavy freight trucks passing by at all hours of the night. They had gone from a sprawling custom-built colonial mansion with a wraparound porch and an immaculate green lawn to a tiny, dark box that smelled permanently of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning chemicals. My mother, who used to host elegant garden parties and brag about her imported Italian leather sofas, was now forced to sit on a stained second-hand armchair she bought from a thrift store, staring at a blank beige wall. She had no massive stainless steel refrigerator. She had no walk-in closets. She had absolutely nothing but the immediate crushing weight of the debt she owed me. My father was forced to take a physically demanding, low-paying job, managing the night shift at a 24-hour home improvement warehouse, just to meet the strict monthly payments dictated by our legal settlement. He spent his nights walking on hard concrete floors, organizing heavy inventory boxes, and dealing with angry customers. A significant portion of his meager paycheck was automatically garnished and deposited directly into my investment portfolio before he even saw the money. They were living the exact life they had previously mocked. They were trapped in a relentless cycle of financial anxiety, performing exhausting labor just to barely survive. They had demanded that I fund their illusion of royalty, and in doing so, they had successfully orchestrated their own permanent exile into the peasantry. The logistical equation was finally solved. The books were perfectly balanced. Every action they had taken against me had been met with an equal opposite and entirely devastating reaction. I remained in my quiet, beautiful penthouse, completely insulated from their misery, knowing that the structural integrity of my life was finally secure. With the financial and legal parameters firmly established, my focus shifted entirely to liquidating the suburban estate. The open house was scheduled for the first weekend of the spring buying season. I hired a premier staging company to transform the interior. They brought in sleek, modern furniture, highlighting the upgrades I had funded. The heavy, pretentious aesthetic my mother favored was erased, replaced by a bright luxury aesthetic that appealed to affluent young professionals. As the doors opened, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The line of luxury vehicles parked along the quiet street stretched for 2 blocks. Prospective buyers flowed through the doors in a steady stream, admiring the chef-quality kitchen and custom bathrooms. I monitored the event remotely from my downtown office, receiving hourly updates from my broker. The marketing strategy created a perfect storm of buyer desperation. By Sunday evening, we received 12 formal offers. By Monday morning, the situation escalated into a fierce bidding war. Buyers were terrified of losing the property in such a competitive market, waiving inspections, and escalating their offers with frantic urgency. I watched the numbers climb higher on my screen, feeling the cold thrill of absolute logistical victory. The final winning offer came late Tuesday afternoon. It was an all-cash offer from a corporate executive relocating from the coast, and it was for an astounding $200,000 over the asking price. The buyer wanted a fast 2-week closing, aligning perfectly with my timeline. I signed the acceptance forms without hesitation. The closing process was seamless, devoid of any emotional attachments or familial drama. When the final wire transfer hit my primary investment account, I sat at my desk and stared at the string of numbers glowing on the screen. The return on my initial investment was staggering. Not only had I recovered the original purchase price, but the massive profit margin entirely dwarfed the $45,000 my parents had stolen from my credit line. I had functionally turned their betrayal into the most lucrative financial transaction of my entire career. The books were not just balanced, they were overflowing with absolute success. 1 year passed following the sale of the house. 365 days of uninterrupted peace, profound professional growth, and complete silence from the people who used to drain my energy. I utilized a significant portion of the real estate profits to upgrade my own living situation. I purchased a stunning, sprawling penthouse located on the top floor of a prestigious high-rise in the absolute center of the city. The residence featured soaring 14-foot ceilings, massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and a private wraparound terrace that provided an unobstructed panoramic view of the magnificent Chicago skyline. The space was a physical manifestation of my hard work, my resilience, and my fierce independence. The absence of my family did not leave a void in my life. It created an expansive clearing where genuine relationships could finally flourish. I surrounded myself with a tightly knit circle of colleagues, mentors, and fiercely loyal friends who valued my intelligence and drive. We hosted elegant dinner parties in my new dining room, shared expensive bottles of wine on the terrace, and celebrated each other's milestones. There were no hidden agendas, no manipulative comments, and no constant demands for financial bailouts. I was a highly respected consultant, a savvy real estate investor, and a woman who commanded absolute respect in every room she entered. It was a quiet Friday evening in early June, exactly 1 year to the day since I had handed my family their eviction notice. I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa in the center of the penthouse living room. The sliding glass doors leading out to the terrace were pushed wide open, allowing the warm evening breeze to circulate. The sky outside was shifting into a deep shade of violet as the sun dipped below the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I held a delicate crystal flute filled with exceptionally expensive vintage champagne, the very same brand I had originally intended to share with my parents before they canceled my cruise ticket. I took a slow, appreciative sip. Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the evening was interrupted by a soft vibration against the glass surface of the coffee table. My smartphone screen illuminated, casting a faint white glow in the dimming light of the room. I set my champagne flute down and reached for the device. I unlocked the screen and glanced at the notification banner. It was a text message originating from an unknown number. I felt only a mild clinical curiosity. I tapped the notification and opened the message thread. The block of text was long, rambling, and dripping with desperate manufactured emotion. The message began by wishing me a happy summer and quickly devolved into a pathetic, groveling plea. It was from Barbara. She wrote that the past year had been an absolute nightmare for her and Richard. She complained about the terrible conditions of their cramped apartment, the physical toll of my father's grueling warehouse job, and the complete isolation they felt after their social circle entirely abandoned them. She claimed she had spent the last 12 months engaged in deep soul-searching, and she finally realized the massive magnitude of her mistakes. She begged for a single opportunity to meet for coffee. She pleaded for a chance to apologize in person, to make amends for the past, and to ask for a second chance at being a family. I read the entire message from start to finish. I processed the words, recognizing the exact same manipulative tactics she had utilized my entire life. She was not truly apologizing for the theft, the gaslighting, or the profound cruelty. She was simply exhausted by the consequences of her own actions. She was tired of living in a noisy, cheap apartment and desperately searching for a way back into my wallet. She miscalculated completely. I did not feel a single pang of guilt. I did not feel the slightest urge to type out a response to argue with her premise or to explain why her plea was entirely insufficient. Engaging with her would only signal that the door was still slightly ajar. The door was not ajar. The door had been bricked over, cemented shut, and permanently sealed. With a steady, deliberate motion, I tapped the screen and deleted the long, pathetic message. I watched the text bubble vanish into the digital ether, completely erased from my device. I then navigated to the contact settings, selected the unknown number, and permanently blocked it from ever reaching my phone again. The entire action took less than 10 seconds. It was a quiet, effortless execution of an absolute boundary. I placed the smartphone face down on the glass coffee table, ensuring the screen was hidden from view. I leaned back into the soft velvet cushions of my sofa and picked up my crystal flute. I looked out through the open terrace doors, watching the city lights begin to flicker and glow against the dark canvas of the night sky. The skyline was a testament to ambition, structure, and incredible resilience, much like the life I had successfully engineered for myself. I raised the glass of expensive champagne in a silent, solitary toast to the quiet, unbothered peace of my home. I did not just survive their ultimate betrayal, I aggressively capitalized on it. The greatest lesson I learned from my family's betrayal is that you can never buy genuine love or respect, no matter how much of yourself you sacrifice. For years, I operated under the desperate belief that if I just provided enough, if I solved their financial crises, paid their bills, and maintained their pristine suburban illusion, they would finally value me as a daughter and a sister. Instead, my endless support simply became the comfortable cushion that protected them from the consequences of their own cruelty. I realized I was actively funding my own emotional destruction. True empowerment begins the exact moment you stop accepting crumbs from people who are feasting at a table you completely paid for. Setting firm, absolute boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When people show you that their affection is entirely conditional and that your worth to them is purely transactional, you must believe their actions over their words. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Walking away from my parents and sister was the hardest but most necessary logistical maneuver of my entire life. It taught me that family is not defined by shared blood or a shared address, but by mutual respect, honesty, and unwavering support. When you finally stop investing your energy and resources into people who treat you as an expendable ATM, you create the necessary space to build a beautiful, unbothered life, surrounded by those who truly appreciate your authentic self. You hold the deed to your own life. Do not ever let anyone treat you like a tenant in it. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members or stop financing the illusions of people who constantly disrespect you, I want to hear your story. Share your experiences in the comments below, and please hit the like and subscribe buttons to join a community of people reclaiming their peace, their boundaries, and their power.